everybody. Welcome to another ASFP Sparking Interest in 2025, believe it or not. And I'll get told off for that because I'm not supposed to date mark these. So today we are talking about conflict avoidance. And in a world in a world where conflict seems to be on the news every day, and remembering the song "Give Peace a Chance" by our friend Mr. John Lennon, although I was more of a George Harrison man myself, it probably couldn't come at a better time. So today we've got Martin Burns, who is leading the Conflict Avoidance Pledge, and I'm just going to give you a little synopsis or a little read of a little CV from Martin. So with more than 20 years of business development and communications experience in the dispute resolution sectors, Martin is currently Director of Dispute Resolution Services with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So for those of you who love the acronyms of this world, that's the RICS. Since 2006, Martin has led the transformation of RICS from a simple administrative appointment service for arbitrators into a multifaceted ADR marketing and product development business. So we've had some questions from the team here at the ASFP and from a few members. So in our usual style, we will go through those in a more casual way than the usual questions and answers. So without further ado, Martin Burns, welcome to the ASFP.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much for reading that CV, which I wrote 15 years ago.
15 years ago.
Can I just perhaps begin by saying I've moved on a little since
Of course.
then. Now I've been working for RICS for 35 years. Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Institution, I often say to people, don't call it institute, it's institution.
It's an institution of chartered surveyors.
And my role now is no longer director. I'm head of ADR Research and Development, and ADR stands for Alternative Dispute Resolution. So my role is very much around trying to encourage people involved in building, construction, land to avoid and manage their disputes and don't end up in courts. And I'm a lawyer by qualification and training.
Right.
And I'm one of those lawyers that the lawyers don't like, because I'm constantly telling people, don't go to lawyers. There are ways you can avoid getting into disputes, there are ways you can manage disputes, and there are ways you can resolve them just as effectively as you've gone to court, but without all the hassle, all the stress, all the costs, and all the time that it takes to go through the court process. So my role is very much around that, working with government and industry to try and encourage greater use of alternative methods of managing and resolving disputes. So sorry to add to that introduction.
No, listen, qualify a little bit more. I mean, it's good that people understand that. It's interesting. I mean, I came from a world, I worked for ASFP member companies, and I was fortunate enough to work not only in the world of manufacturing of products, but also the installation of the same in the UK and supply to third parties outside of the UK. And I was involved in 3 arbitrations.
Oh, good. We have lots to talk about.
I never lost one of them. I have to say, I never lost a case. What I found was that as soon as the formal legal process starts with lawyers and court and barristers, is everything becomes so much more entrenched.
Exactly.
That's my experience of it.
That is exactly what I was... one of the reasons, I think, why we started working on this conflict avoidance process and this conflict avoidance campaign is because of that. You know, you imagine the boardroom. You've got an employer, a big employer, infrastructure employer, and you have the contractor's representative in front, and they're to and fro about a question. It might be about whether the contractor is entitled to a compensation for an event that they say was unforeseen when the contract was made. And they've been at it for maybe a few weeks, they've had a few meetings, and they just can't agree. And the normal scenario then is one of them looks down to the other end of the boardroom table where the lawyers are sitting there waiting. And when it's handed over to the lawyers, that's it. Those 2 people, the directors, the commercial people, they lose control. It goes to the lawyers. Now, you can't blame the lawyers, because the lawyers do what they're supposed to do, which is represent the interests of their clients. mainly from a legal perspective. And then lawyers are trained litigators. That's what they know how to do.
Yeah.
And litigation, by its very nature, is adversarial. So you get into entrenched positions, you get into situations where it's eyeball to eyeball. And that relationship then between the contractor and the employer can be damaged as a result of that, because you're no longer negotiating, discussing. It's no longer, hello, Mike, hi, Martin. It's Mr. Ward, Mr. Burns, that kind of thing. And the lawyers then take control. The outcome then is if it goes to court, it takes years. And you don't go to court unless you've got a lot of money to spend.
And judges, my experience of judges is that they like the word reasonable. So they want people to go to arbitration before they come to them. They want the parties to have explored every avenue of resolution before it comes to them.
That's such a good point, Mike. The rules that actually govern the court system, everybody uses the court, whether it's a litigant, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's the judge, are all bound by what's called the Civil Procedure Rules, or CPR. And Civil Procedure Rule 1 actually touches on that very point, that the courts should look at all reasonable efforts to try and avoid a long, costly trial. And that onus is also on the parties. And sometimes I think lawyers forget about this, that there is actually an obligation in law to try and avoid ending up in court. This is actually moving even more now, and I think it's partly to do with this campaign that I'm involved with in the conflict avoidance side, is that courts are now increasingly questioning parties. So a judge will question, what have you done? What efforts have you made to avoid ending up in front of me?
Yes.
And the judges are going even further now, because there was a leading case, it was just over a year ago, in fact, a Court of Appeal, you might have come across it, Churchill and Merthyr Tydfil.
I'm not familiar with it, I'll be honest.
I won't go into a great deal of detail about it, but what that Court of Appeal decision did was clarify that a judge can't just ask you the question, the judge can actually tell you, right, we're stopping litigation and you're off to ADR, alternative methods. So they have that power now to do that, and the courts have been clarified. So you're right, judges are taking this step to not just merely encourage, and by the way, if a judge encourages you to do something, you better listen.
Yes.
To order you to go and mediate or use some form of alternative dispute resolution rather than the trial process. And then sitting in the background to all of this is this movement in the government side, and it's cross-party support to try and look at making ADR, alternative methods of avoiding, managing and resolving disputes, an integral part of the legal system, to the extent that they're looking at making, if you like, mediation or something like conflict avoidance a mandatory step before you end up in court.
Yeah.
And a great example of this actually being real is in May 2023, the government made it mandatory that anyone wanted to take a small claims action. So you've heard of small claims courts, but there's no such thing as a small claims court. It's an action that you take in court. But if you've got a dispute where the amount you're claiming is less than £10,000, that's a small claims action. Any small claims action, the parties are mandated to mediate first. And that came into force in May 2023. And what the government is now looking at is how can we now make that similar right across the civil litigation procedure.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, certainly post Grenfell, we know that principal contractors have, for want of a phrase, a legacy issue. So they have occupied buildings that have problems with them. They're legacy problems. So the building's being handed over, it's been occupied, principal contractor's been paid. We know that that some of the exposure to them is, in terms of financial exposure for corrective actions, is significant. And my experience was very much along the lines of if a job went a bit toxic and the principal contractor was clearly going to not return a reasonable net return, there was this sort of blanket go after all the subbies to recoup what the losses are going to be, so that and that was a habitual problem some time ago now.
It's a cultural thing as
Yeah.
well, and it's been around for a very long time. I've worked at RSS, as I say, for 35 years, and at 35 years, I've seen the industry, the construction industry, described as being rampant with dispute. That the whole language of construction is about us and them, win and lose.
But the contracts were written that way.
Yes.
The contract, and this is sort of what I was trying to get onto, because I'll sort of come onto some of the more some of the questions, but you don't end up somewhere if you haven't come from somewhere, and you have to resolve the problem upstream. And I personally think this is where the world according to Mike Ward comes into play for a moment, that the culture of what we're talking about is driven by how the contracts are formed, how they're written, how they're structured, and that drives a more litigious environment during or after the construction process.
Couldn't agree more. The group that I'm here representing, if you like, so I work for RSS, but RSS is not just the lone voice in this. This is a coalition. So the Conflict Avoidance Coalition is made up of a number of bodies. There's about 60 altogether currently. RSS being one of them, but big names like the Institute of Civil Engineers, the Royal Institute of British Architects, but also big employers, Transport for London, Network Rail. There's contracting companies like Balfour Beatty and others, all part of this. And they all recognise that, just as you say, that the whole culture of construction is set up to enable, if you like, disputes to happen.
Yes.
And they do. And there's a report undertaken by the consultancy firm HKA called the Crux Global Report on Dispute Resolution. And the numbers in that report are eye-watering in terms of the cost of disputes to the industry. This is globally. And costs and delays, and they talk about cumulative delays, not in months or years, but in centuries, on 1,600 projects or so that they examined. So you're right, that the whole culture of the construction industry is being geared towards conflict, and a lot of it is to do with the contractual relationship between the parties. And one of the things that this Conflict Avoidance Coalition that RSS are part of and that I work with is looking at is, why is it that parties too often amend standard forms of contract? So you have contracts which are suites of contracts published by the JCT, for example, and the NEC. A lot of work has gone into producing those contracts for different types. So there's a suite of contracts for different types of projects. And yet, if you go into the offices of an organisation that's negotiating with some suppliers for a major project, you'll see that contract with so much red ink on it, where they've crossed out things. They've effectively rewritten it to the point where nobody really understands what's in it, but they've created the environment for conflict and disputes, because often it can be one-sided. Why do that when you've got standard forms that are very, very well written and everybody understands?
Yeah, no, you're right, and it's very similar. And I think one of the things that's driving this change, of course, is, and this is another subject we could probably sit here and talk about for hours, is how risk and responsibility gets pushed down through the supply chain as the design construction process happens. And of course it gets pushed on to predominantly those that have the least. So you have your client, you have the principal designer, principal contractor, and then you have the subcontractors. And the risk and responsibility gets pushed down to the subbies. Well, some subbies could be subcontractors to subcontractors.
Yeah.
And that particular company could be made up of a ma and pa, father-son company doing fire stopping. And they own their own, they have no offices. They've got a house with no mortgage on it. They've got 2 10-year-old transit vans on, they've got more rust on them than a North Sea fishing trawler. And something goes wrong, and of course the main contractor's pushed it onto the tier 2, tier 3 subbie. That subbie's pushed it onto the people that they employ. You're pushing on the risk and responsibility of what could be quite a high value issue to people who've got nothing. And that the legality, the legal chain of how all this is structured drives that, as well as the litigious behaviours that accompany it.
Mike, you've clearly got a handle on this. The coalition, it's been going since 2018, had its first conference in October. It was hosted by the Houses of Parliament, so it's held at Portcullis House. And the keynote speaker we brought in that day was Sir John Armitt. And John Armitt was previously president of the ICE, the Institute of Civil Engineers, but he's currently the chair of the Infrastructure Commission, sort of a government body that advises on this. And his keynote speech was all about that, about the problems of pushing the problem down the supply chain and making people responsible, rather than taking an attitude of let's share the risk, let's share the responsibility. This is an adventure that we're both on in terms of delivering the project. You want to make profit and deliver, we want this delivered on time and on budget. And that's the whole ethos behind the Conflict Avoidance Coalition and what it's trying to achieve. And one of the ways that the coalition is trying to get that message across is by developing what it's called the Conflict Avoidance Pledge.
Yeah.
And the Conflict Avoidance Pledge was launched at the ICE, in fact, 2018, January 2018. So it's been going a while. And its whole purpose is to, if people sign up to it, is to signal that that business, that individual, that organisation, that government body, that government entity is actively endeavouring to avoid the situation just described, to work towards collaboration, to work towards avoiding conflict. And let's face it, people can't agree on things all of the time. You're going to have disagreement, but when they do, to not allow them to escalate into something that is going to cost them, going to send them to court, to try and resolve it through means and mechanisms that will deal with it quickly, early and cheaply, and amicably.
Yes.
Going
yeah.
eyeball to eyeball.
A guy I worked with years ago who'd worked for 3 principal contractors. He was a wily old fox, but he was a good wily old fox. He said, the effort in resolution should be proportionate to the size of the problem.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
And I always remembered that. So, if somebody stole your pencil sharpener, you don't want to take them to high court, dear. You may as well go and buy another pencil sharpener. So let's just go through. So there's a reason why you're here to talk about Conflict Avoidance Pledge. But of course, the ASFP signed up to that pledge. It's part of our member services within the ASFP hub. ASFP members take note. Anyone that sort of sits within the member hub, which is our sort of member-only central hub of things that support our members, and that can be anything from stuff like this to sort of more business-related things to more fire-related things. We try and get people in to talk about it because we think it's important that not only the wider stakeholders know, but also our members know, because it's actually available for them to use. So I mentioned before about qualify, just in case. Just tell people about the Conflict Avoidance Pledge and where the value is in it for them to sign up to.
Well, as I said, the Conflict Avoidance Pledge was developed by the coalition. It was best way of getting this across maybe is just to tell a little story of how it came about. And I remember we were attending the first meeting of the coalition, and it started actually with 6 organisations, 6 bodies. That was RICS, the Institute of Civil Engineers, Royal Institute of British Architects, the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, Transport for London, and Network Rail. And the senior project directors and senior managers from those organisations sat around because we had this idea that the construction industry needed to change its attitude about risk, about collaboration, and about avoiding conflict. And somebody in that 6, and I confess I've sometimes said it was me, but it wasn't me, but somebody in that group of 6 said, what about a pledge? And then we discussed, and the idea of a pledge was that if somebody signs the pledge, they're actually signalling to the rest of the industry that if it's a contractor, I'm a good person to employ as a contractor. If it's an employer, I'm a good person to work for because my organisation, my business, will work with you to try and avoid conflicts and try and manage those differences of opinion that we inevitably will have along the way in a fashion that means we don't get into adversarial mode, we don't have a bun fight, that we don't end up in court. And it was such a good idea, and that we then started to work on a draft. The beauty of the situation we were in is that we had two senior project directors, the project director for Transport for London and the project director for Network Rail, as our audience. So we came up with a form of words that they, as people within those organisations, were prepared to sign up to. We knew we'd nailed it. And it only took a couple of weeks, by email, back and forth, to come up with, it was 4 short paragraphs. And those paragraphs, and I'm afraid I don't have them here, and I can't recite them off by heart, but those 4 paragraphs cover this point, that we are committed to working collaboratively, we are committed to putting measures in place that help to avoid and manage conflict. And they signed up to it, Transport for London and Network Rail. And not only that, their supply chain immediately in the next couple of weeks were signing up to it. And then we had a formal launch. We launched it in January 2018. The Deputy Chair of the Transport for London keynoted, and it was a big event. There's over 500 organisations that have now signed up to it. And some of them are huge. And now it's started to move outside of the UK. And so we're talking actually to businesses and organisations and government entities in places like Abu Dhabi and Canada. So it's really spreading out. That was just one of the outputs of the coalition. But the coalition also recognised that people just sign up to this. We need to make sure that they're actually, making the commitment, they're actually doing it. So created 3 standards around the pledge itself: bronze, silver and gold. And bronze is simply you've signed it, and we will put measures in place to monitor that. Silver is you've started to put measures into your contractual provisions, about how you will manage and how you will avoid conflict. And these are agreed with the other side. And gold is really you're an advocate for it. And a great example of this is, I'm going to drop a name if you don't mind, Stephen Blakey at Network Rail.
Okay.
And Sue Barrett also, who was project director at Transport for London. She's now the project director for the refurbishment of the Houses of Parliament, which is a huge, big
job. Wow, that's a gig that most people would probably shy away from.
It would be. She's an incredible person, and her and Stephen, in fact, have been immense advocates for the whole concept of working as employers with contractors as a partnership, as a collaboration, and putting measures in place that try, in the first instance, to avoid conflict. But as I say, differences of opinion do arise. To deal with them, use a word you used very early on in this conversation, reasonably.
Yeah, the word reasonable. So if, in terms of the barriers to entry, you talk about the bronze, silver, gold.
Yeah.
We have barriers to join. ASAP is not just a write a check, get the logo. You have to be third-party certified and various other things. Nothing is bulletproof, by the way. There's no guarantee that a company of a member body is going to do the right thing. And we work on the basis of SCEB for our competency framework: skills, knowledge, experience, behaviour. And skills and knowledge drive behaviours, experience drives behaviours. This sort of falls into the behavioural part of signing up to something that changes your behaviour as an individual or as an organisation. What's the barrier for entry? So if we've got a principal contractor thinking of signing up, or a medium-sized specialist subcontractor, how do they join, and what are when I say barriers to entry, I mean what's the sort of process that they have to go through?
The process is very simple. It doesn't cost anything, by the way. I think that's always a question. It's free to sign up to it.
Free's good.
RSS, as a leading part of the coalition, volunteered to act as a sort of receptacle for parties who want to sign up to the pledge. And so people go onto the RSS website, which is rss.org, and then do /CAPLEDGE cap pledge.
We'll put it on the link. I have to do this because it really annoys Max, so I'll say we'll put it here. Okay, Max. And then Max has to put it there afterwards.
Okay.
edited it.
And that will take you onto a website, which first of all, it will show you who signed the pledge. So you have all these businesses and organisations. And I think that in the first instance is impressive, just to see how many and who they are who have signed up to it. Then it will give you information about the pledge, what it means. Then it'll give you information about how to sign up, and it's a very simple process. And then it'll show you the various levels, the bronze, silver and gold. Bronze is just signing the pledge, and from that you get the ability then to use a logo. There's a logo attached to that, which you can then put on your materials, and companies do. And that logo itself is a signal that you're a pledge signatory and that you've made this commitment. And it'll also give you information about how to apply to get onto the silver and the gold. And both of those, by the way, there's no cost in terms of getting there. But what you have to do is go through some hoops in order to show that. And this then is evaluated by not the coalition as a whole, but a steering group within the coalition, which has been set up. There's about 20 that form the steering group, and they will assess applications to be silver and gold.
So the silver and gold, I mean, the evidence you have to provide, is that things like to evidence that you've got correct business systems in place, like your ISO 9001, for instance, and stuff like that.
Similar to that, you'll have to show that you are incorporating the measures within your contracts. So it might be mediation, it might be a conflict avoidance panel, it might be a dispute board. Those are, I'm probably speaking a foreign language to some people when I say these things now, but they are techniques and measures that can be used instead of going through a formal process like going to court or arbitration. They're designed to manage and resolve differences of opinion informally and amicably. So you can show that you've put those measures into your contract. And of course, gold then takes it to the next level. Gold is you're actually doing it. And there are situations that you can demonstrate where a conflict may have been avoided as a result of you putting these measures into action.
Okay. Is there, and I always like sort of tangible examples, touch, feel, smell. Is there any examples where, for instance, and I'm saying this because I know how people who join organisations think, because they'll think, what's the benefit? So people join the ASAP for certain benefits, and one of them is to carry the ASAP logo, because if you're a specialist subcontractor, quite often a principal contractor would look and go, well, if it's passive fire, ideally we want an ASAP member as opposed to a non-ASAP member, because they know that member is third-party certified, and there's their skills and knowledge is probably somewhat more advanced than somebody who isn't, etc. Is there any examples of where, and there's probably two questions to this, is there any examples where, say, a principal contractor that's signed up to the pledge has procured the products and services of a subcontractor because they've also signed up to the pledge, because that is a what's in it for me sort of example, and has that sort of been evidenced? Have you ever come across that?
Anecdotally, because that's how it works.
Of course.
We're not in contact with the 500 signatories on a day-to-day basis, but anecdotally we're hearing that's how it works. We've also heard of employers who are signatories, gold signatories, who have made a condition of tendering that anybody tendering agrees to sign the pledge. And during the project lifetime agrees to reach gold standard. So we've seen that, and that's the reality. We've also seen the benefits of the conflict avoidance process in action. And I do some webinars on this, so I'm afraid we can't do this, and I'm going to have to cough.
It's okay. We're allowed to cough. Any natural functions are allowed on our podcast.
Just coughing. The point I was going to make is in webinars sometimes I can demonstrate, just put a slide up, and there's a slide I've shared on a few occasions, which was actually produced by Transport for London. So it wasn't my slide, it wasn't the coalition slide, it was Transport for London's. And it was a slide showing from a period of 2016 to I think it was about 2018, the number of compensation events that occurred on the refurbishment project of the London Underground. So if you've been to London in the last few years, you will see a huge amount of work done on the London Underground, particularly in places like Victoria,
Go tomorrow.
Tottenham Court Road is a great example of a huge amount of investment on redesigning and modernising the whole system. It's a huge project, £7 billion worth, I think, ultimately in terms of the lifetime of the project.
Road was because it's Crossrail as well, wasn't it? And
yes,
it was. It's been for quite a few years a big hole in the ground.
Yeah,
I was amazed logistically how they did that, squeezed between just basically across 3 or 4 streets, that they managed to crane everything in and out, and
yeah,
I mean, logistically,
remarkable piece of engineering.
Yeah.
There's other engineers, the Thames Tidal Tunnel as well, and people don't even know about it, and it's huge, and it's underneath the Thames. But this particular project, the slide I mentioned was a slide that TfL produced as part of a roadshow thing that we were doing to promote conflict avoidance techniques. And they showed that using a conflict avoidance technique, that the compensation events on this project had gone on a very steep incline. They were happening all the time. And the amount of those compensation events that had turned into actual disputes was also going up on a steep incline. Shortly after the pledge was introduced, and they introduced measures within their contracts to manage and avoid disputes, the number of compensation events dropped off a cliff.
Wow. Okay.
The graph speaks volumes. It was just amazing. It just dropped off a cliff. It didn't disappear altogether. I mean, there was still along the bottom, there was a much less incline happening. And they introduced a method of conflict avoidance called the conflict avoidance process. And there's so many acronyms, and they all end in CAP. So there's a conflict avoidance pledge, and there's a conflict avoidance process. So it's CAP. But that technique worked really well for them, and they're still using it.
And I think proportionally, and I don't know if you've got the stats, but the cost in time and money of resolution in a more, say, litigious way through the courts has got to be more than the cost in time and money of amicably putting it right.
Oh yeah.
So there has to be a net benefit for both, because of course principal contractors are based on time and money.
I have a number that might help.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, some numbers, because I mentioned TfL. I mentioned their introduction of the CAP procedure, and when the pledge was launched, and it was launched by the deputy chair of the Deputy Commissioner for Transport for London, I think that's his proper title. He's also moved on. I think he's also at the Houses of Parliament. But at that time, he talked about how the cost of resolving a typical construction contract dispute between TfL and a contractor, a small dispute, would be somewhere in the region of £50,000. That's a small dispute. To resolve a large dispute, we're talking anything over £500,000. And that's before it gets to court. That's just using construction adjudication or arbitration. I mean, there are very effective methods. The cost of using conflict avoidance process that they put in place averaged out at £12,000, and it was split between the parties. So you can see the huge amount of difference it already made. And that was even the larger disputes. So the larger dispute would cost more than £12,000, but when you average them out, that's the amount they were paying. So it really did benefit them.
And that's just the monetary.
That's just the monetary.
Let alone the time.
The
resource. Yeah.
One issue, a dispute where a large infrastructure employer used the conflict avoidance mechanism rather than go to court. This was a matter that was on its way to court. It was about £200 million worth of potential dispute.
Wow.
It would have taken 2-3 years to resolve in the courts. It would have taken millions of pounds, all that time, all that money, and it was resolved in somewhere about 3 months at a cost of £40,000 using this. And the benefit was the relationship between the parties wasn't damaged. They were still, one of them had an outcome that they weren't entirely happy with, but what they were given was a sense that if you do go down to court 3 years and you spend all that money, you're going to get the same answer.
Of course you are.
And they realised that. And so they managed to avoid all that cost and come to a settlement that they both could live with. Because what the whole process is about is getting the two people to talk to each other. I often give presentations on dispute resolution, and I put up a big list of different types, and I've baffled you with them a moment or two ago: arbitration, adjudication, expert determination, conciliation, dispute boards, litigation. Now, all of these are methods of resolving disputes which are legally acceptable, can lead to binding decisions, but all the ones I've just mentioned there, and there are many, many more, put people at odds with each other. You know, that they're kind of acting in an adversarial mode, and one of them would win, and even when they win, they're probably not happy. They didn't get all they wanted, or the process itself was unfortunate for them. The thing about more amicable resolution through things like dispute boards, early neutral evaluation, mediation, conflict avoidance panel, CAP, is that it's about helping both parties reach their own settlement, but keeping them working towards it, talking to them. It's very constructive.
And they both feel in control still.
Absolutely.
Because I think the thing with final judgments is that, you know, once you enter that court process, you do effectively lose control of your own destiny.
So many times I've heard people say that, And I mentioned it earlier in this talk when I said that, you know, somebody looks down the end of the boardroom table at the lawyers, and it's at that point when they instruct that lawyer that they lose control over the outcome. So the commercial people, you don't get a commercial decision, you get a legal decision.
Correct.
You lose control.
Yeah, it's a good thing to remember. So in terms of, you're here today, and thank you, appreciate you coming. It's strange actually. We get people coming here, and there's never any middle ground. They're either trembling and we have to, you know, get them to take a couple of Valium, or they're rubbing their hands with glee, you know, looking through the local list of potential agents that can turn them into social media stars. And there's never generally any sort of middle ground. In terms of the engagement that you've been doing, so how does the coalition engage with wider stakeholders in terms of adopting this, and how can organisations like the ASFP help and support that?
Well, I think the reason we're talking is a great example of that. You know, that there was a conversation I had with Nadine, who works for you, as part of a kind of reaching out to different organisations, different people that we do as part of the coalition. So sometimes at the very beginning, the coalition was knocking on doors. Yeah, it was talking to government departments, talking to government people. It was talking to leaders in, you know, big infrastructure businesses and contractors, and telling them this is the way forward. It was about giving presentations, webinars. It was about creating the literature that could go on websites and inform. I mentioned the conference that was held at Portcullis House of Parliament back in October. That was another way. What we're finding now is that all of that knocking on the doors has reaped benefits over the last few years, because now people are coming to us. We've heard about this. Tell us more. How can we engage with it? How can we help spread the word? And that's been fantastic. So using what you might call marketing channels, using the sort of all the sort of different types of marcoms that are available to us as big organisations, RSCS, ICE, REBA, the architects. That's one way of doing it. And doing what I'm doing now. Yeah.
There's probably a lot for you to go at in terms of engaging with the representative bodies, in terms of getting their members to sign up to this. Because, of course, you've got Build UK, you've got all the fire crowds, so you've got FIA, Fire Industry Associations, they're active fire, we're passive fire, and we do quite a lot of stuff together. Is there... one of the questions was how can ASFP members contribute to the CAP objectives? Is that they have to? Is that about them signing up, or is it about them adopting the requirements of what they sign up to?
Oh, it's definitely both.
Yeah,
definitely both. There's no point in just signing up to it and then not doing anything about it. I think you need to take action. The whole idea is to make the people who are signing up to make their lives easier as well. Yeah, that's what it's about. It's about making when we had our first meeting, I remember I told you there was the 6 of us we met, and that coalition has grown now to about 60.
Yes.
And we came up with the pledge as an idea. And I remember somebody at that meeting saying, well, what are we trying to do? And I said, well, we want people to avoid disputes. He says, let's be ambitious. We want to change the whole culture of construction. We want people not to just accept what has happened for so long now, which is this conflict-ridden, adversarial approach to construction contracting, that people need to be brought into a mindset where they're prepared to be proactive and work to be collaborative, work to avoid disputes and to manage them in a much better way. And the pledge is kind of at the heart of that. The pledge is not the be-all and end-all. I have to say the pledge also has had government support in the sense that many of your listeners will be aware perhaps of the construction playbook.
Yeah.
And the construction playbook is a guide to all those bodies involved in public works projects on best practice. And at page 50, it says, sign the pledge. And what's interesting about the playbook's on a basis of comply or explain basis. So you're expected to comply, and if you don't, you need to have a good explanation. And so if the government in the playbook is saying to bodies involved in public works projects, sign the pledge, then really you should sign it. But signing it should also be something that organisations and individuals and businesses see as a good thing for them, because it's part of their marketing. If you have the logo, the conflict avoidance logo, it's saying something about you that is part of the attraction that you're trying to demonstrate to a potential employer. And similarly for an employer. An employer says, I'm good to work with because I'm not one of these who's going to be stamping on you and pushing all the blame and all the risk over to you.
Yeah. I think and I think that's important, because I think how buildings are constructed in the legal, operational, commercial sense has to change. There has to be a cultural shift. All of the stuff post Grenfell has all been about, cultural shift towards improving standards, improving competency. And those are the sort of practical things, improving standards of products, making sure they're tested in accordance with, what they were designed to do and evidencing it properly. So CCPI, Code of Construction's product information, is creating a much more simpler format for the client to understand the performance of the product. The gateways, Gateway 1, 2 and 3, and I've sort of got a question actually from this. That's designed that you're not designing as you're constructing. You should have designed and then got that signed off, and 3 is construct, because of course there's many examples that you are. Design and build has 2 meanings. Design and build is a method of construction, and design and build is another method of construction, which is you're designing as you're building, not that the design responsibility has gone over to the principal contractor. Has things like, and this is the sort of question I was leading to. Sometimes Max will tell you that I do have to follow a significantly long yellow brick road to get to the question that I wanted to. Has the gateways affected the work that you're doing? Has that had an impact on the work that you're doing? Has it changed the culture that you're operating this in, for instance?
Yeah. I have to say a great deal. So I've worked for the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, RICS, for 35 years in the world of dispute resolution. And for many of those years, it was all about trying to close the gate after the horse has bolted.
Yeah.
It was all about trying to find ways to resolve disputes where people were already entrenched, already, spending lots of money on lawyers, and sometimes, and very often in fact, spending more money than there was actually disputing. Over the last few years, my personal involvement in working with conflict avoidance, working with the coalition, has brought a whole new dynamic to the way I work. And in fact, my institution, which is a large institution in terms of its membership, 140,000 members worldwide, has really taken on board this whole ethos of we as an institution, as a chartered institution, and the charter says that we must work in the public interest, has taken this on board and said, we really must push this agenda to try and change the way the construction industry deals with conflict and disputes on contracts, not just here in the UK, but internationally too. And so, yeah, the last few years, and in fact, it's interesting because the concept of itself has actually gone into other areas where chartered surveyors don't just work in construction. You'll know that.
No.
That it's such a diverse profession.
Yeah.
And I've now found, working with government entities and professionals in the rural sector, where there are often disputes between landowners and tenant farmers. How many times now have you seen farms change into things like farm shops, tourist destinations, go visit the animals?
Well, Jeremy Clarkson could fill us in on that, couldn't he?
Exactly. So the whole farming world has changed over the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
But that creates strife and differences of opinion between the people who own lands and the people who are the tenant farmers who are farming them, around who pays for the construction of the new restaurant facilities and the new farm shop, and who's benefiting the most out of that. The landowner will want more rent, and so we've been working with people in the rural sector about introducing conflict avoidance and conflict management, and they're learning from what's happened in construction. And we're also seeing it in other areas, compulsory purchase disputes in the telecom sector. And I've recently worked with a government task force, ADR task force, on the electricity transmission sector, about putting in place methods that help resolve disputes, that mean people don't end up going to court and don't get into loggerheads.
This is about putting pylons in people's back gardens, one assumes.
Or close to them,
or close to them,
exactly.
Yes. In terms of the farmers one, I've seen what Jeremy charges for a pork pie at his place, and I think he should pay.
Yeah.
He can clearly afford it. He'll probably have a go. We may not have to cut that out, depending on how litigious Jeremy Clarkson is feeling at any one time. So in terms of, so we talked about the gateways, and we've talked sort of about how people can get involved, and we've had some sort of practical examples of the fact that it does work. From our point of view, I mean, it's an interesting dichotomy for the ASFP, because we represent principal contractors and specialist subcontractors.
Yeah.
And the principal contractors is quite a new addition, and it took a bit of persuading the subcontractors that allowing, I say the word allow, I'm sure there's a different word, but creating the environment that principal contractors would want to join the ASFP was the right thing to do. Was interesting, and we almost sort of, I almost picked up the phone to you, Marty, to say, actually, we could probably do with a bit of help here. But the outcome has been that actually the principal contractors have benefited from a much closer relationship in terms of understanding the specialist subbies issues, but also the specialist subbies have been able to contribute to the principal contractors some of their legacy issues, in the sense that things have been designed and installed that may not have been tested, and they've been inspected, and all of a sudden you've got retrospective testing going on of fire systems, configuration of fire systems, or they're having to remove them and put alternatives in. And that relationship, I think, has been a real positive move for us. In terms of the people that sign up, is it mainly specialist subcontractors and principal contractors, or is it stakeholders all the way through the design, procurement, engineering, procurement, construction, handover, facilities management, post-occupation?
It is a real surprise to me when I look at the list of people who sign up to it, just how varied they are. Some include government departments,
right?
Some include principal contractors, right down across the supply chain. There's even one-man bands have signed up to it. So the range that have signed up to the pledge thus far has been quite wide. What we're looking at is trying to broaden it even further. And it was interesting listening to you talk about the principal contractors and the contractors, and how actually now that's working in a positive way because they're talking, they're having a conversation, they're learning from each other, understanding each other's positioning, where in the past perhaps that might not have been easy to do if you're not actually engaging in either through an organisation or in some other way. I think what we're looking at is how can we grow the number of organisations who are engaging with conflict avoidance, engaging with the pledge, using methods, and through that get them much more involved in understanding each other's positions. I remember talking to Sue Barrett, who I mentioned earlier, who is now at the Houses of Parliament. She talked about the typical situation is that the employer is trying to get the cheapest contractor it can in tendering process. You know, the lowest bidder gets it. Yeah,
I'm shocked.
I know.
I'm shocked.
And the tactics from the tenderer's point of view is put in a tender, they'll get the job, and then work through the contract to try and get as much out of it as they possibly can.
Yes.
And that involves conflict and disputes.
Yes.
And what we're trying to do through the coalition is to get to an environment where that stops, that the employer pays a decent sum and doesn't just go, a race to the bottom of the pit.
The race to the bottom. Yeah, we did a bit of a survey on principal contractors in terms of procurement, and it was a very simple question. Advise why you made a procurement decision away from the specified product without telling us it was a commercial decision.
Good question.
And I didn't get a single answer.
Oh, surprise.
Because the predominant reason for making a switch from a specified to an equal and or approved was a commercial decision. Now this was all leveled towards competency, because we talk about, it's interesting because the buzzword has gone from training to competency. No one talks about training anymore. Everybody talks about competency. And if you ask most people what competency is, if you got 10 MDs in a room and said, tell them what competency is, you'll get 10 different answers. It's the same question if you got the same people in a room and said, tell me what marketing is, you'd get 10 different answers. But competency, defined competency. First of all, you have to define the role, define what competency is within that role, find the learning things to achieve competency, do them, and then evidence them on a framework of a network that you would join and upload it. And that's a program that we're going through, and a lot of our peers are going through at the moment in our specialist areas. And it all leads from the building safety regulator and the ICSG thing. Anyway, it's a different story. But the point we asked the question about was, how do you evidence somebody is competent within procurement to make that decision outside of it being a commercial decision? How are they competent to say, I'm going to swap out this product with 17 pages of performance specification and application criteria assigned to it by the architect and the engineers and the product manufacturer, and you're going to swap it out because it's 20% cheaper? How is that person in procurement qualified, competent to make that decision? And the short, sharp answer to it is, and I make no apologies for saying this, is they're not. Because there's no structure. It's not their fault. There's no structure in place to support competency within procurement of products. There's actually, on the flip side, there's no structure in place to support competency of sales and distribution of products. So you come in and you say, I'd like 12 tubes of this mastic, please. It's been fire rated, it's been mastic, it's been specified on the job. And the young little 18-year-old guy behind the counter said, well, don't buy that. Buy these that we've got boxes of next to the counter. There's 25% off this week. And automatically that 18-year-old has entered the world of design responsibility, because he's now entered the world of swapping out the specified products. And again, there's nothing in place that supports people who work in sales and distribution in terms of competency. There's competency from the manufacturers. This is what our product is. This is what it does, but there isn't competency in understanding the sales or procurement process.
It kind of begs the question then, how can we as a coalition help organisations and businesses and individuals who want to sign up to the pledge, want to understand it, but have no real concept of what dispute resolution measures are there. I've seen a blank look from you a couple of times, Mike, when I've talked about different types of measures, early neutral evaluation and things like that.
I try not to give blank looks. I always try to stay engaged, so I apologise for that.
No, don't worry. I'm trying to recognise them. But one of the things that the coalition has done, it's not just about the pledge, the coalition. The coalition is looking at a whole variety of methodologies and ways to try and educate and change the industry. And a very good output from the coalition has been a toolkit. We call it a toolkit. It's an information toolkit. It's very easy to access. It's in a PowerPoint form at the moment. We're looking to update it. And what it does from procurement to end of project, give information, very sort of high level information, so it's not overly detailed, about what people can do to give effect to their commitments if they sign the pledge. Everything from what conflict avoidance methods can they use and incorporate and how they work in principle, and signposts into where they can get more information free of charge without going down that route, all the way through to, they've got to the point where project's close to an end, there's a dispute that might go to court. What can I do to avoid ending up in court, to manage this and get it resolved so that I'm not spending all my time and money and all my people on this dispute. So the toolkit's also there, and I mentioned that website that hopefully you will...
we'll do this.
And if people just look for the toolkit there, and it's very easy to access. As I say, it's simple information. It's on 6 pages. It's not overly detailed, but it does also signpost people into institutions, whether it's Institute of Civil Engineers, whether it's RSCS, or organisations that we haven't mentioned here, like the Dispute Review Board Foundation, who are very equipped to provide information about systems and techniques that you can use and employ within your relationship and your contracts.
Excellent. I've got one question. Is there any firms of lawyers that have signed up, construction lawyers that have signed up to the Conflict Avoidance Pledge?
Interesting, isn't it?
Or are they slightly turning their noses up at the idea of it?
The vice chair, so we have a chair of the coalition, it's Len Bunton, whose name you will know. The vice chair is Jeremy Glover, and he is a senior lawyer with Fenwick Elliott, one of the large firms. We also have people within the coalition who are going to cook, and other law firms. Have firms signed up to the pledge? Not enough, is my answer to that. And it was interesting because when we mentioned the conference we had at Portcullis House in October, this was raised on a few occasions by the audience about lawyers signing up to it. I have to say there are quite a few lawyers who are very supportive and very much involved in it. A lawyer called Anthony Armitage is leading the campaign that I mentioned earlier to encourage people not to amend standard forms of contract.
Yes. So
there's a lot of lawyers who are very much behind this and very involved, but have law firms actually signed up to the pledge? Not enough.
No, and I was being slightly mischievous in asking the question, because my personality unfortunately lends me to thinking of mischievous questions to ask. Yes, I mean, I think it's a bit sort of inviting foxes to the hen coop to a certain degree. But
well, I've got a mischievous question for you then.
Yeah.
So we're talking about this, and I know you've done some reading up, but before you and I sat down, how much did you know about the Conflict Avoidance Pledge?
I knew as much as I'd been told by virtue of our relationship with you, of signing up to it and us bringing you into the member hub. I'd never, like I say, I got involved in 3 arbitrations as a specialist subcontractor. So I sort of understood the process, and I understood the need not to sort of, end up walking all the way up the courtroom steps. Maybe meeting
and has this conversation helped?
Yeah, it has. I mean, I think from my point of view, this falls under what people talk about Grenfell a lot, and it was the trigger to drive culture change.
Yeah.
But people use the word culture change a lot, and I think quite often it's misrepresented, because culture change is all about behaviours predominantly.
Right. I agree.
And we see a lot certainly in the world of fire, we see a lot of virtue signalling on social media. Most of it will add no weight to the argument. and certainly no tangible benefit, to the industry moving forward. But changing the culture of how the construction chain, the design and construction chain, has a relationship with one another, professionally and commercially, and if this has a positive impact on that, is actually a tangible, very, very good tangible example of what I would call culture change, is because we've changed the way we operate and we change the way that we interact with each other. And if there's less formal legal proceedings going on, costing huge amounts of money, taking huge amounts of time, then that must have a positive impact on the time and cost of actually constructing buildings, because there must be an element of all of that factored in to how long something takes. So when I was talking to somebody the other day that they've doubled the amount of time they factor in for weather episodes to affect the delivery of buildings, and they've based this on their views and research into the current debate around global warming and the fact that we're warming up and therefore we have more severe weather episodes.
It's interesting.
So we don't have hurricanes here, we have storms that get given names, which is slightly, is it scaremongering to a certain degree? I mean, obviously, who was the weatherman that got it completely wrong back in the 80s?
Was it Bill Giles?
Was it Bill Giles or was it Michael Fish? It was one of them, wasn't it?
One of those, yeah.
And he said, don't worry, there's nothing happening. And then, of course, it happened. So I'm assuming there's a certain element of not letting that happen again. But on the other hand, clearly weather is we're getting wetter and it's getting warmer. I mean, it doesn't feel like it stopped raining for the last couple of weeks. And they were saying that they've actually factored in, they might factor in on a project that might take 6 months, a week of delays based on weather episodes. That's now 2 weeks based on weather episodes because there's more water around or there's, more severe winds that mean that they can't do certain things.
So that's a real evidence of somebody acting proactively.
Yeah.
And that's what we want. We're trying to encourage people not to react. I've talked to people who say, well, I've worked in the construction industry for so many years, I've never had a dispute.
Yeah.
Fine.
Look at you.
Look at you. And when it happens, you're going to have to react to that.
Yeah.
And your reaction might be one that's wholly uninformed because, as you said, you've never had any experience.
Yeah.
The whole idea of the conflict avoidance process, the conflict avoidance pledge, is to encourage people to be more proactive. When you're procuring, think about it then. Think about what can we do in this procurement to put into place measures that will help us maintain our relationship and avoid getting into disputes going forward. And then not get into a position where you're looking at this hugely amended contract about a year and a half down the line because you've got this dispute with the contractor or the employer, and you think, what do I do? How am I going to resolve this?
It raises the debate, doesn't it, on the competency of the person who was changing the contract in the first place. So how are they, and this is, I'm sort of becoming ad nauseum on this, but I keep applying to, my thought process on competency keeps coming back to this, is, people do things, but actually how can they evidence that they're competent to do it? Now, you've come from a legal background, you have the ability to evidence your legal status by virtue of passing your exams and being part of the, becoming part of the bar and things like that. I'm sure. Mine was a degree in English literature, so I took a different route. I chose to read books and smoke fags when I was 18, not sort of remember Jones versus Smith in 1963, and but it always raises the point with me now, because I've sort of become indoctrinated with this ideology of it, is how is that person deemed competent to change the contract in the first place? What makes them unless it's just a commercial justification?
Of course, most contract amendments are, I'll use the word encouraged, by lawyers.
Yeah.
And
because it creates opportunity for litigation later on.
Well, you can be quite cynical about that. Yeah,
I'm never cynical, Martin. I promise you. Everybody at the ASFP knows
I've often said in webinars and seminars I've given that there's nothing worse for a litigation lawyer than a litigation client who's not litigating. I mean, that's me being cynical.
Yeah.
But to be fair to the lawyers are trying to do their best for their clients in order to get the contractual situation right for their client, you know, and to look at the project as a unique project and to say, well, this is the contract that works for that project. But it's gone too far in the sense. I remember walking into an office of a project director who we were going to have a conversation about conflict avoidance process, the one that I mentioned has worked successfully before, and they had a contract in front of them that had been back and forth between them, their lawyers, and the other side's lawyers, back and forth, and it was completely rewritten. You know, there's so much lines through it and reading. So I think, to be fair to lawyers, they're working in the interests of their clients. They want to get the contract right for the job, but what's happened is that contracts are being amended beyond recognition.
Yeah.
They've been amended to the point where, what's the point of having the standard form in the first place? Why don't you just write a contract for that job?
Yeah.
And I'd argue in any case that the standard forms are fit for purpose. Use them as they are.
No, I think so. And I've worked with both, and I've seen things on contracts and on specification schedules where the specified product has been taken out and somebody had written one line that says contractor's choice. What on earth does contractor's choice mean? And how is the contractor qualified to make that choice? They're not, because they're not competent to make that choice, because actually the principal designer with design responsibility further up the chain had already made that choice.
Yeah.
So you're right. And I think in terms of that relationship, and I think the beauty of this conflict avoidance pledge is that it takes away that sort of Samson, that Goliath thing, which is, you know, you walk around any of the major principal contractors, they've got legal departments bigger than most specialist subcontractors' entire business.
Yeah.
So of course they will always be taking the lead on how the relationship is penned out. And of course, a lot of specialist subcontractors don't have a legal department. They probably have somebody in accounts that works one day a week, and a 16-year-old doing a bit of marketing because they've redone their website for them. But they're entirely reliant on what comes down from what they assume are people who are more qualified than they are to write out what the terms of the relationship are. And that's not healthy.
It's not healthy. And if you go back to the days where the JCT was formed, so the Joint Contracts Tribunal was formed by a whole raft of organisations because there were so many different types of contracts and people didn't understand one from another, to create a suite of contracts that were easy to understand, easy to comprehend, standard forms that you could use. You know, so you use a minor works on a minor works project.
Yep.
You use a design and a build and one of the design and build for a major works contract and a major. All of that done so that people, just as you've described, who are further down, who are less resourced, won't have to work their way through a whole minefield of changes to clause, amendments here, statements within the contract that they don't understand. The person who wrote it possibly does, but maybe even the person who they're writing on behalf of doesn't understand. It's just using the standard forms.
And if there's a change, put an addendum, but keep it as a separate document so you know that it's an addendum. Yeah. You can see it's outside of the standard contract. And that's fine. Just stick an addendum on the back of it.
Yeah. So we talked about, you know, one way of avoiding conflict is to do less of changing standard forms of contract, be much more clear about precisely what you're contracting to do and use. And I think the idea of putting addendums is fine. Talked about the Conflict Avoidance Pledge, which is a signal, whether it's from an employer, whether it's from a contractor, whether it is across the supply chain, that this is somebody, an organisation that is committed to trying to avoid conflict, unnecessary conflict, and even when differences arise, to try and resolve them the best way without ending up in court. And to be fair about it and to work much more collaboratively. But the coalition is also about promoting specific types of measures that you can put into your contracts. So I met Jeremy Glover, who's the vice chair of the coalition, who's a lawyer. He's also the current president of the Dispute Board Review Foundation, and his organisation very much about putting in place, particularly on larger projects, you know, mechanisms that live through the lifetime of a project, dispute boards. And this has a great deal of attraction to businesses and projects outside of the UK. So we're working currently with Abu Dhabi, who are very much behind the whole concept of dispute boards and conflict avoidance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I think very much. I've just come back from Dubai a couple of weeks ago at a show called Intersect, and they're very keen to adopt competency frameworks, dispute resolution, because they have significant capital building projects that you get into the realms of that sort of stuff can delay. And one thing they don't like is delay, because they all want the next tallest building over there.
There's nothing causes delay like a dispute.
Absolutely. Quick question on, because I've sort of laboured a little bit, and it was an unconscious bias probably slightly. In terms of clearly the relationship between principal contractor and specialist subcontractors needs improving, but of course the principal designer and principal contractor relationship of who sort of where responsibility sits, and of course the truth is it sits with both of them, and it also sits with the client, believe it or not. How much? What's the sign up been between as many architects' practices? Because obviously you said the RIBA are involved. Have many practices signed up to this?
Individual practices at the moment, I'd say not enough.
Right.
If any, the organisation itself is behind it. So RIBA was a founding member of the coalition and a founding author of the pledge itself. But certainly that is an area where I think maybe the coalition should, in the light of this conversation, sort of put some energy towards, in terms of getting that part of the construction process, the design element, get that in there first, early. But I think there's a lot of work still to be done. When we started the coalition, when we started this campaign, we felt that we really were pushing a big boulder up a very steep hill.
Mm-hmm.
And
that feeling.
And there were only a few of us doing it.
Yeah.
It's incredible the amount of momentum that has happened within the last 18 months or so. And Len Munton, who's not here, who's chair of the coalition, he has single-handedly extended the coalition's reach. He is unashamedly a door knocker, and he's made that happen. But also people who are on the coalition, and I'm going to mention a few names, and the people who I haven't mentioned, forgive me, because I just can't mention everybody.
Too many to know. But
I mentioned Stephen Blake, I mentioned Sue Barrett, and the people like Ed Shriver and Ashley Belcher and Jeremy Glover and others, who within their day-to-day jobs every day are making things happen. They're going out, they're talking to the lawyers, they're trying to persuade people to change the culture from this sort of adversarial incompetency into working to develop a much more collaborative relationships, much more cooperation, sharing of risk and responsibility rather than pushing it down the supply chain.
Absolutely right.
And putting into place distinct measures, dispute boards, conflict avoidance panels, early neutral evaluation. All of these things, by the way, are described in that toolkit that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. And all of them are specific measures. I'll just describe one, if I may, because it's been something I helped to create. It's new in the sense that it's been around for only 6 or 7 years, but immensely effective. And I remember sitting at a table with 4 project directors for 4 of the big firms, Costain, Langer, Rock, Taylor Woodrow, Bam Nuttall, and people from London Underground and Transport for London. And they were putting this contract together to refurbish the London Underground, and they'd done an immense amount of work between themselves to create a much more collaborative culture, to try and move away from this adversarial claims consciousness. And what they wanted to do is that we didn't want to ruin all that by having one dispute that ended up in court.
Yeah.
We want a safety net. Can you make us a safety net? And I worked with some colleagues and we came up with this CAP, conflict avoidance process. And the idea of CAP is that when they're sitting in that boardroom, at that point when they start to look to the lawyers to hand it down for litigation or arbitration, instead of doing that, they say, well, let's get another opinion. We're arguing here about something that's rather specialist, something that's rather specific. Why don't we get somebody who is a real credible subject matter expert to get a grip of the question that we need an answer to and give us their answer? And in order to make that happen, that person needs to be neutral. They have to be independent. And that's partly where RSS comes in, because RSS is this neutral body that can help source somebody who is the round peg for the round hole, that subject matter expert. Let's get this person in. And the first thing that person does then, both sides already accept that this is an expert. They know who it is. They think, yeah, this is Mike Ward. He really does know this subject. This question.
Don't put those.
All right, we won't pick Mark. We'll pick somebody else.
But I know people that could help you in the world of passive. But
we've got him now. Okay. The first job Mike does is he needs to understand what is the question you're grappling with. What is it that you need an answer to? And once you've got you can put it to them then and say, this is the question. Yep, you've got it. Fine. Your job then is to be inquisitorial. This is the whole difference between adversarial dispute resolution, courts and arbitration, where it's all about trying to persuade the neutral party that you're right.
Well, it's about the contract, not about what actually not about the works designs and the elements that sit behind it.
Yeah. So this neutral expert then, he or her job is then to act inquisitorial, and they may go on site, ask questions of people who are doing the day job, who really understand it. Eventually, after a couple of weeks, comes back to the boardroom with a report, and that report said, this is my answer to your question, this is my recommendation for settlement, and it's non-binding, but it's fully reasoned out, it's fully explained. I'm an expert, been around the houses on this subject so many times, been to court as an expert on this subject, and this is my answer, and this is probably where you're going to end up if you go to court, but you would have spent millions of pounds and 2.5 years doing it. Now, the parties are not bound to accept that because it's non-binding, but it does give them a platform to come to their own agreed settlement, because they now have a really good idea where this is going if it does go down the adversarial route. Yeah. It sounds a little kind of hypothetical, it sounds a bit ethereal in some ways, but it's been used, to my knowledge, 40 or 50 times on some major issues between some big employers whose names I can't mention here because I haven't asked for permission yet. Every single time it's been used, the matter's settled without going any further. Yeah. In some cases, it's settled by just taking those recommendations in their entirety and implementing them. In some instances, it's given the parties food for thought, and they've used it as a platform to find an innovative way to find a settlement. But in every case it's been used, it hasn't gone any further. And that is now something that the Abu Dhabi government are talking to us about. They want to pilot that there, and governments in Canada are piloting it. Okay. It's just one example of a few that people can put into their relationships that can help avoid unnecessary escalation to courts. And it's a subject, Mike, I could go on all day long, but we have to come to an end sometime.
I think it's a brilliant idea, and I would encourage anybody to sign up to it, because what it's saying is we know things are going to go wrong, but actually there's a different way of dealing with it when it does.
Thank you, Mike.
Is that fair thing to say?
I can't argue with that.
What I would say is the ASFP will continue to push this because we think it's a blooming good idea.
Great.
Thanks for coming, Martin. Good to see you.
Cheers.